welcome back to another video feature of the Immersive Worlds Handbook. Today I'm in Las Vegas, Nevada at the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino. And just behind me is part of what I would consider to be one of the more elaborate theming areas that I can imagine. And what's significant about this area, and I'll take you around a little bit, is that it's certainly at the entrance of the casino, but it's far away enough that probably most guests don't even see this particular space. So let me take you around a little bit. And so I'm showing you a little bit more here of the grounds. And as I said in the video, I've been in the Mandalay Bay many times, have stayed there before on multiple occasions, and for some reason this part of the casino resort escaped me. And I think it's kind of interesting because it's the one example of theming on the strip that is a location of theming on the strip that is relatively far from the actual hotel. It's a bit of a trek, and I'm showing you here some still images. And one of the things I was doing was trying to determine exactly the sources of the theming here. And certainly you could think about tropical experiences, any number of, when I say the tropics, any number of places around the world, equatorial areas. Certainly we often, looking at some of these images, would think of certain parts of Southeast Asia. We would also perhaps think of, in general, just cultures that are known for tropical environments and maybe have a sense of history to them. Clearly, when you look at this image and many of the other images, they're trying to, in a way different from Caesar's, they're still trying to create a sense of history in terms of the space that they're creating here for the guest. And of course here we see one of the key symbols, I think, at the Mandalay Bay, and this is nature and water, and this certainly carries into what you get with the wave pool at the back of the resort. So I was actually working on this particular video that we're watching now on the Mandalay, and it occurred to me halfway through that I was falling into a trap, something I'm always talking about in terms of looking at theming. And, you know, so in this particular video, I was trying to put things together and trying to address the origins. Looking at any number of images here from the Mandalay, trying to ask myself, where did these structures come from? Everything from the griffins to some of the fountains to some of the statuary. And then it occurred to me in a lot of my work on theming that when you really want to talk about what theming is, you can't just associate the notion of theming with original places or even any type of originality. And certainly we could say that theming involves associations from culture, associations from place, whether literal or more figurative and more imaginative. History, and a lot of that we get on the Vegas Strip, certainly with Caesars and some of the ancient history that's being played with there. We also can think of relatively connected association of emotions and mood and lifestyle. So there could be a lot going into the construction of a place, and even though it's a theme space, we shouldn't assume that there will be a direct reference or even a meaningful reference in terms of what we get when we look at a place and we begin to have these associations with our mind in terms of the theming that is going on. But as I said, when I originally started looking at some of this, I asked questions about, questions basically about the origins of the particular things that we see at the Mandalay. And I think whenever you do this, as I show in the slide here, you are getting into a problematic area of authenticity, and we shouldn't assume in any case, in any representation, that there will be an original and that there will be a copy. And certainly the French postmodernist thinkers Jean Baudrillard convinced us, I hope, of that fact, that in the world of simulacra or copies, there are multiple copies, and more often than not, we can't tell an original from a copy. And when we get into words like fake and so forth, which often gets applied to some of the material and theming, I think we get into the problematic politics of authenticity. And I also wanted to mention, just in terms of looking at theming itself, and this will be a later video feature I'm still working on, I talk about a series of characteristics of theming. And basically this is why we would theme a place or develop a story through material architectural design means. So everything from theming recalling a place, theming being more than a stereotype, theming creating associations and feelings and moods and so forth. And I'll put some of these up on the screen so you could look at the entire list. All of these remind us that when we go back to a place like the Mandalay Bay, we can't assume that what's going on here is simply a play of the original and the copy. And in fact, if we study work that's been done, particularly anthropological work, I'm thinking of the work of Victor Turner on symbolism in his important work, The Forest of Symbols, he talks about how a symbol like this particular iconic structure here at the Mandalay can function in multiple ways. Symbols condense, and by condensing that means you encapsulate within any single form a variety of associations that we have, emotions, feelings, attitudes, and so forth. At the same time, symbols also are multi-referential, and that means they can refer not just to one thing or one place or one time period, but to multiple places over time. So when looking at some of these images from the Mandalay, indeed I should be more aware of this and should be focusing more on this idea of how this particular use of theming at the Mandalay Bay is drawing on a variety of associations and trying to make a variety of connections. So I had to stop just for a moment and interrupt my own work, and let me go back to the work now and continue with the discussion here of theming at the Mandalay Bay Casino Resort in Las Vegas. And so with these ideas in mind, with this brief interruption that I offered, I think we can take maybe a different sort of look at the Mandalay Bay and get away from this concept of authenticity and notions that theming, like the theming we see at the Mandalay, is clearly a correlation with one particular place. And as I mentioned in that last video, there are a lot of associations we can think of. Now, I was digging around and trying to do some background research and discover a little bit more about the Mandalay Bay, and from what I could find, in '97, the Circus was interested in developing a tropical-based casino, and as I'll show you a little bit later from some of the news reports at the time, there's a sense that this particular theming project was not intended at the time to be purely place-based, if that's possible. Now, I found one report on the web, and I haven't included that here because it's a very curious report, and it certainly supports some of my notions here that I'm suggesting in terms of the theming that's going on at Mandalay Bay and being more symbolic theming and less place-based or literal-based theming. And this particular report claims that in '98, the Project Paradise, as it once was called before it was renamed Mandalay Bay, I believe in '99, it discusses here a press report from Circus and then chairman Glenn Schaefer. And it's a very interesting quote because it suggests that Mandalay Bay is, according to this source, taking imaginative liberty with the map. We know that islands have long held a special lure for their traveler, promising escape, protection, lush atmosphere, and they yearn for a return to paradise. Our version of that isle at Mandalay Bay is likewise mythic. The name Mandalay itself, in literal form, comes from the colonial capital in Old Burma, standing at the far edge of the empire in the 1800s, where the East met the West. Today, we've taken that distant outpost, placed it on the island, and borrowed from the design vocabulary of the East meets up with the West. There's an architectural mix in the interiors and facades of Mandalay Bay that's not specific to any time or culture, but hints nonetheless at a lost empire in all its grandeur and exotic trappings. And it goes on to talk about the romantic traditions and drawing on some of these associations and what they continue to discuss, or the chairman continues to discuss, as being taking some liberties with the theming. Now, again, I searched for the original, and this web source claims that it was in the Circus 1998 corporate report, and I did end up reading that, and I found that on the MGM site, but I couldn't exactly find this quotation, but I did find it to be very interesting. Now, again, in looking at some of these images, I think we might conclude that because you can't associate the architecture, the design, the sculpture, the artistry, the aesthetics here with any one particular place, that the Mandalay is an amalgam of different places, of different associations, and very much based on this notion of fantasy, perhaps selective imagination, and taking liberty with theming and recreating place or associations of place or associations of culture. And so with this in mind, I wanted to show you a source I could verify on the web, and this is a discussion of the Circus planning the new mega resort in Las Vegas, which again, the name has changed over time. But as I mentioned here, this will be the most high-end themed resort in our portfolio. And goes on to talk also about entertainment and a little bit about what the resort will have to offer to the guest. But if we look a little more closely, it's actually this next quotation, which I've highlighted here so you can read it better, that I thought was very, very interesting about Mandalay. And I'll just read this to you. "It will be more from adventure stories and cinema than any actual place. It's a state of mind." And I think this goes along with a lot of theming that we see around the world. Jean Van Eden, who contributed to a couple of my books on theming, has talked about this and has talked about the work of Sol Kerzner and the Lost City in South Africa, and this idea of creating theming that's based more on the imagination of something than any sense of an actual place. And again, we should be very critical of this notion of an actual place, but nonetheless I think it's interesting to think about how imagination plays a very vivid role in terms of some of the theming that goes on in places like Mandalay and many others around the world. And going along with associations, I wanted to offer you this scan of the current Mandalay Bay, and again, all the resorts on the Vegas Strip have gone through change over the years. But you could see in this quotation here, they're talking about the Mandalay Bay beach, that the emphasis here is on a tropical lifestyle, and again, that can mean a lot of different things to many people, but they're not drawing any attention to place itself. And you see this throughout the resort and some of the changes that have taken place, taking out the aquarium in the lobby as an example. And you also see it in the literature. If you go to Mandalay Bay's main website and browse around, you're not going to see anything really about the origins, the foundations, how this imagination that I've been addressing here gets formed. Instead, it's about luxury, it's about fun, it's about being part of paradise, and so forth. And at the same time, I think it is interesting to think about origins, and some commentary about the Mandalay on the web noted the fact that if you look at Burma, or now known as Myanmar, in the actual city of Mandalay, it's rather inland. It's not connected to the sea, although there are certainly rivers and waterways locally. And again, I guess if you get caught up too much in those details, you lose sight of the fact that any thematic project that's developed in the world is based on imagination, on forms of remaking. And I mentioned earlier in my interruption video that we have to be very, very careful in terms of the politics of authenticity. And it's not just a French thinker like Jean Baudrillard who would tell us to be very suspicious of notions of there being originals and there being copies and so forth, and that we can make one-to-one correlations and talk about fidelity, which I think is something that gets discussed a lot in the study of remaking. And I think the point is, in even a more layperson sense, that we have to be very cautious to assume that any imaginative project from a design standpoint is going to hold some sort of rooting in the notion of an original. And I think in looking at Mandalay Bay more through this concept of symbolic theming, we begin to appreciate some of the complexities of projects like these. I think we can appreciate the sense of luxury that we see here. We can appreciate the sense of creativity and artistry that goes into a project like this. At the same time, we can certainly ask questions and say, well, why did they choose this particular object over this object? And in doing that, we create more of a dialogue about a space. And in cases like these, where we don't have a lot of tale or narrative foundation, and compare this, for example, to some Disney theme parks where there's a ton of focus on very elaborate origin myths, if you will. In this case, we don't have that, but nonetheless, I think we can still have dialogue with the space. For example, we could look at the griffins here and look at the significance of the griffin in all sorts of world cultures. And in fact, They symbolize a lot of things. They symbolize different things in different cultures. But as an entrance moment here, I think they're very powerful in terms of conveying something to the guest. And the same thing here with this very, very dramatic structure here, just at the entrance to the Mandalay Bay. And so in terms of offering some closing points about this topic today of symbolic theming, I focus here on an interior feature from Mandalay, and rather older image I took. And I was trying to look at these figures, and again I determined that they had an appeal, but they didn't have a specific rooting in a culture, a foundation, a history, a people, and so forth. But that's not a problem. And again, I think the critic would say that this is an issue for us, that we can't unravel notions of fidelity, notions of foundations. In fact, I think it creates a much more dialogic sort of world where we begin to think about the proliferation of copies. And to be a little Derridian, focusing on Jacques Derrida, we begin to think maybe more about the idea that there always is a continual deferral of signification of symbols in the world, and there's never one final resting point. So I'll leave it at that today before I conclude here with the video. So I hope you enjoyed this video feature today here at the Mandalay Bay in Las Vegas, Nevada. Please come back for additional video features of the Immersive Worlds Handbook.